I still remember the smell of rosemary and thyme that used to fill my kitchen on Sunday mornings, back when my husband Gerald was alive and our son Tommy was just a boy with scraped knees and a gap-toothed smile. That kitchen was the heart of our home, where I taught Tommy to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, where Gerald would sneak up behind me and steal tastes from whatever I was cooking, where we celebrated birthdays and mourned losses and simply lived our lives in the warm glow of the stove light. The countertops bore the stains of 40 years of meals, the wooden cutting board was worn smooth from thousands of chops and slices, and every cabinet held memories as much as dishes. That kitchen was mine in a way that went beyond ownership, beyond the deed that had both our names on it before Gerald passed, beyond the mortgage we paid off together penny by penny. It was mine because I had poured my soul into it, because my hands had touched every surface with love and purpose, because the very walls had absorbed my laughter and my tears. So when my son's wife stood in the doorway of that sacred space and told me to stay out of her kitchen, something inside me cracked like an egg against the rim of a bowl, clean and final. Tommy brought Michelle home 7 years ago, and I wanted so desperately to love her, to welcome her into our family with open arms the way I had always imagined welcoming a daughter. She was beautiful in that sharp, modern way, all clean lines and calculated smiles, and Tommy looked at her like she had hung the moon and stars just for him. I saw the warning signs early, the way she would rearrange my furniture when she visited, claiming she was just trying to help, the way she would comment on my clothes with that particular tone that sounds like concern but cuts like criticism, the way she never quite met my eyes when we spoke. But Tommy was happy, or at least he seemed happy, and after Gerald died I had learned that happiness is precious and fragile and not to be questioned too closely. So I smiled and nodded and tried my best to make her feel at home, never realizing that she was already planning to make it hers. Gerald's death had left me hollow and aching, wandering through rooms that felt too large and too empty without his presence filling them. Tommy worried about me, called me every day, visited on weekends with Michelle in tow, and eventually suggested that maybe they should move in with me. Not permanently, he said, just until they saved enough for a down payment on their own place, just until I got back on my feet emotionally, just until we all adjusted to this new configuration of our family. Michelle had smiled when he proposed the idea, but I caught something glittering in her eyes, something cold and calculating that made me shiver despite the warmth of the room. Still, the house was so quiet without Gerald, so achingly empty, and the thought of having Tommy close again, of hearing his voice in the morning and his footsteps on the stairs, was too tempting to resist. I said yes without thinking it through, without understanding that I was opening the door to someone who saw my grief as an opportunity, my loneliness as a weakness to exploit. The first few months were pleasant enough, almost like having my boy back home again, except now he came with a wife who seemed to always be watching, always assessing, always finding small ways to assert her presence. She started rearranging the kitchen cabinets, claiming she was just trying to be helpful, to make things more efficient and modern. My grandmother's china, which had always lived in the glass front cabinet where I could see it and remember Sunday dinners with family long gone, was moved to a high shelf in the back pantry where it gathered dust in the darkness. The cast iron skillet that Gerald had given me on our first anniversary, seasoned with decades of love and careful use, was relegated to the bottom drawer because Michelle preferred non-stick pans that she ordered online. My spice rack, organized alphabetically the way I had kept it for 40 years, was rearranged by frequency of use, which in Michelle's mind meant that the paprika and turmeric and cardamom I used in my traditional recipes were pushed to the back while her bland basics held pride of place. I tried to be understanding, tried to remind myself that young people have different ways of doing things, that I needed to be flexible and welcoming. But each small change felt like an erasure, like I was being slowly rubbed out of my own home, my own history being rewritten to suit someone else's vision. I started spending less time in the kitchen, letting Michelle cook more often, retreating to my bedroom where I could still surround myself with Gerald's photographs and the quilt his mother had made us as a wedding gift. Tommy seemed oblivious to the tension, caught up in his work and his marriage, and whenever I tried to mention something to him, Michelle would appear with that practiced smile and a reasonable explanation that made me sound petty and possessive. Was I being too sensitive, I wondered? Was I clinging too tightly to the past, unable to adapt to the natural changes that come with sharing a home? Then came the morning that changed everything, the morning that stripped away all my uncertainty and showed me exactly what I was dealing with. I had woken up early, unable to sleep as I often did in those days, and I went downstairs in my robe to make myself a cup of tea the way I had done every morning for 40 years. The house was quiet, grey dawn light filtering through the windows, and I moved through the familiar space with the ease of long practice. I was reaching for my favourite teapot, the blue one with the chip on the spout that Gerald had always meant to replace but never did, when Michelle appeared in the doorway. She was already dressed and made up despite the early hour, and she stood there with her arms crossed, blocking the entrance as if she were a guard protecting something precious from an intruder. She said my name, just my first name without the warmth or respect of any title, and told me in a voice that was all ice and authority that she needed to talk to me about boundaries. I stood there holding my teapot, confused and still half asleep, as she explained that she found it stressful when I came into her kitchen without asking, that she needed her space to be respected, that she had worked hard to organize everything the way she wanted it and my presence was disruptive to her system. Her kitchen, she called it, as if the 40 years I had spent in that room had evaporated overnight, as if the meals I had cooked and the love I had poured into that space meant nothing at all. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, not quite anger yet, more like shock, like the moment after you cut your finger but before you feel the pain. I asked her what she meant, my voice small and uncertain, and she sighed as if I were a child who needed a simple concept explained in even simpler terms. She told me that since she was the one doing most of the cooking now, since she was the one maintaining the household, she needed to feel like she had control over her domain, and that meant I needed to ask permission before using her space or touching her things. Her things, she said, gesturing to my grandmother's mixing bowls and my mother's recipe box and the coffee maker Gerald and I had received as a wedding gift. I felt the shock giving way to something hotter, something that made my hands shake and my vision narrow, but I kept my voice steady as I reminded her, very quietly, that this was my house, that my name was on the deed, that every dish and pot and utensil had been mine long before she existed in our lives. She just smiled, that cold calculated smile I had learned to recognize, and said that Tommy had agreed it would be better for everyone if I respected her boundaries, that he understood how important it was for a woman to feel like she had her own space, and that surely I didn't want to cause problems in their marriage by being difficult. Something inside me broke in that moment, not loudly or dramatically but with a quiet finality, like a door closing softly but permanently. I set down my teapot very carefully, took a deep breath, and told Michelle that she was absolutely right, that I should respect boundaries and that perhaps we needed to have a clearer understanding of exactly where those boundaries were. I asked her if Tommy was awake, and when she said he was still sleeping, I told her to wake him up because we were going to have a family meeting right now, immediately, before another moment passed. She looked startled, probably because I had never pushed back before, had never challenged her authority or questioned her pronouncements, but something in my face must have convinced her I was serious because she turned and went upstairs. Tommy came down 15 minutes later, rumpled and confused, with Michelle trailing behind him wearing an expression that was part concern and part smugness, as if she had already told him her version of events and was confident he would take her side. I stood in the kitchen, my kitchen, and I looked at my son with a mother's clear eyes for perhaps the first time since he had brought this woman into our lives. I saw how tired he looked, how the light had dimmed in his eyes, how he seemed smaller somehow, diminished, as if Michelle's presence was slowly draining something essential from him. And I realized that my silence, my accommodation, my desperate desire to keep the peace had not protected him at all, had in fact enabled something toxic to take root in what should have been his sanctuary. I spoke very calmly, very clearly, and I told them both that I had made a mistake in allowing the boundaries in our home to become so confused, that I had been so lonely and grief-stricken after Gerald's death that I had not been thinking clearly, that I had allowed our temporary arrangement to become something it was never meant to be. Tommy started to interrupt, to apologize if Michelle had overstepped, but I held up my hand and continued. I said that this house, every room in it including the kitchen, belonged to me, that while I had welcomed them to stay here temporarily, I had never given up ownership or control of my own home, and that it was time we remembered that fundamental truth. Michelle's face went pale and then red, and she opened her mouth to speak but I kept going, my voice growing stronger with each word. I told her that I had tried to be accommodating, that I had swallowed my hurt and my anger and my sense of displacement because I wanted so badly for us to be a family, but that her words this morning had shown me exactly what she thought of me and my place in this house, in my son's life. I said that I would not be told to stay out of any room in my own home, would not ask permission to use things that I had owned for longer than she had been alive, would not be made to feel like an unwelcome guest in the space where I had built my entire life. And then I said the words that I had been too afraid to say until that moment, the words that felt like both a declaration and a liberation. I wanted them to leave, to find their own place, to start their life together in a home where the boundaries were clear and the ownership was theirs. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock that had marked time through all of my joys and sorrows. Tommy looked stunned, turning from me to Michelle and back again as if he were watching a tennis match he did not understand. Michelle's face had gone through shock and anger and was settling into something calculating, and I could almost see her mind working, trying to find an angle, a way to turn this to her advantage. She started to speak, her voice taking on that reasonable, slightly wounded tone she used so well, talking about how she had only been trying to help, how she had sacrificed so much to take care of me in the house, how hurt she was that I would misunderstand her intentions so completely. But I did not let her finish, did not fall for the manipulation I could now see so clearly. I told her very simply that she had 30 days to find another place to live, that I would be happy to help Tommy with a down payment if they needed it, but that this arrangement was over and no amount of discussion would change my mind. Tommy finally found his voice, asking me if we could talk about this privately, just the two of us, but Michelle grabbed his arm and told him in a tight, angry voice that they did not need my charity, that they would be gone within the week, that she had never wanted to live in this outdated house anyway. And then she turned and went upstairs, her footsteps sharp and angry on the wooden stairs that Gerald had refinished himself the summer before Tommy was born. Tommy lingered, looking at me with hurt and confusion in his eyes, and I felt my resolve waver for just a moment. But then I remembered Michelle's face when she called it her kitchen, the casual cruelty with which she had tried to erase me from my own home, and I knew I was doing the right thing even if it broke my heart. I told Tommy that I loved him, that I would always love him, but that I could not let him or anyone else make me a stranger in the home I had built with his father. He nodded slowly, not quite meeting my eyes, and then he too went upstairs, leaving me alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of 40 years of life and love. They were gone in 5 days, not even taking the full week Michelle had promised. Tommy came to say goodbye, awkward and formal, telling me he had found a rental across town, that they would be in touch once they were settled. Michelle stayed in the car, staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge me even as Tommy hugged me briefly before walking away. I watched them drive off, my son and his wife, and I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep and terrible sadness that it had come to this, that standing up for myself had meant losing him. The house is quiet again now, the way it was after Gerald died, but this time the silence feels different, not empty but somehow clean, honest, mine again in a way it had stopped being. I cook in my kitchen at any hour I please, make tea in my chipped blue teapot, use my grandmother's china even though there is no one to share the meal with. I have moved everything back to where it belongs, restoring the geography of my life to its proper order, and sometimes when the evening light falls just right through the window over the sink, I can almost see Gerald standing there, smiling at me, telling me he is proud that I finally remembered who I was. Tommy calls occasionally, brief awkward conversations where we dance around the hurt between us, and I hold on to hope that someday he will understand, that someday he will see what I saw. Michelle left him 6 months after they moved out, and though he did not say it directly, I could hear the relief in his voice when he told me, the sense of a weight lifting, of air finally reaching lungs that had been slowly suffocating. He asked if he could come for Sunday dinner, just him, and I said yes through tears I did not let him hear. This Sunday he is coming home, back to the kitchen where I taught him to crack eggs, back to the table where we celebrated and mourned and lived our lives, and I am making his favorite meal, using my grandmother's china and my mother's recipes and all the love I have stored up in this house that almost stopped being mine but never will again, not ever, not for anyone.